Imagine your homeland, everything you've ever known, being sold to another country without your consent. For the people of the Philippines, this wasn't some bad dream, it was a reality. In 1898, after more than 300 years of colonial rule, the Spanish Empire sold the entire Philippine archipelago to the United States for $20 million. But how can a country, a nation of millions, be bought and sold like a piece of property? This wasn't just a real estate deal. It was a geopolitical earthquake that betrayed a revolution, sparked a brutal war, and sealed the fate of a nation for the next century. This is the unbelievable story of how a secret agreement, a staged battle, and a controversial treaty led to one of the most shocking transactions in modern history. By the late 19th century, the once mighty Spanish Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its global territories had mostly broken away, and it was desperately clinging to its few remaining colonies, including Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Spain had ruled the Philippines for over 3 centuries, imposing its religion and its authority. But this long, often oppressive rule had bred deep resentment. Across the islands, the spirit of revolution was catching fire. For years, Filipino patriots had been organizing, writing, and fighting for their freedom. This movement boiled over into the Philippine Revolution of 1896, led by brave figures who dreamed of an independent Filipino nation. At the heart of this struggle was Emilio Aguinaldo. A charismatic and determined leader, Aguinaldo rallied his people against their Spanish colonizers. By 1898, the revolutionaries were on the brink of victory. They had pushed Spanish forces out of the countryside and controlled most of the islands. On June 12, 1898, from the balcony of his home in Kawit, Cavite, Aguinaldo formally declared the independence of the Philippines. The new Filipino flag was unfurled for the first time, a national anthem was played, and for a glorious moment, it seemed freedom was finally at hand. The revolutionaries had all but won their war. All they needed to do was take the capital, Manila. But halfway across the world, events were unfolding that would change everything. The United States was watching Spain's troubles with great interest, and it was about to enter the picture in a way no one saw coming. The spark for American intervention wasn't in the Philippines, but in Cuba, another Spanish colony fighting for its independence. American sympathy for the Cuban cause, whipped into a frenzy by sensationalist newspapers and fueled by economic interests, hit a breaking point in February 1898. The USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, and the U.S. blamed Spain, declaring war in April. For Commodore George Dewey of the U.S. Navy, this was the moment he'd been waiting for. Stationed in Hong Kong, he immediately sailed his fleet, the Asiatic Squadron, to the Philippines. On May 1, 1898, he steamed into Manila Bay, and in just a few hours, completely destroyed the aging Spanish fleet. It was a stunning victory that left the Spanish forces in Manila cut off from the sea. Seeing a common enemy, the Filipino revolutionaries and the Americans formed a shaky alliance. Emilio Aguinaldo, who had been in exile, returned to the Philippines on an American ship, believing the U.S. would back his fight for independence. Bolstered by their new, powerful friends, Filipino forces tightened their siege of Manila by land while Dewey's fleet blockaded the bay. The Spanish were trapped. The stage was set for the final liberation of the capital, or so it seemed. The Americans had a very different plan, one that didn't include their Filipino allies. The Spanish, cornered in Manila, faced a humiliating choice. Surrendering to the Filipino revolutionaries, the people they had subjugated for centuries, was an unbearable blow to their national honor. They would much rather surrender to a fellow Western power, the Americans. What happened next was one of the most bizarre and treacherous acts of the war. In secret, American commanders negotiated a deal with the Spanish Governor General. The plan was to stage a fake battle. The Americans would pretend to attack the city, and the Spanish would put up a brief show of resistance before raising a white flag and surrendering Manila only to the Americans. There was one non-negotiable condition. Filipino forces were to be kept out of the city at all costs. What makes this even more absurd is that the war was technically already over. Spain and the U.S. had signed a peace protocol in Washington the day before, on August 12, 1898. But because of the time it took for news to travel, the commanders in Manila didn't know. So, on the morning of August 13th, the show began. American ships lobbed a few shells at an abandoned fort, and U.S. troops advanced. Unaware of the script, Filipino soldiers, thinking a real battle was happening, joined the attack. They fought and died alongside men who were just actors in a play. Just as planned, the Spanish surrendered to the Americans, who promptly raised their own flag over the city. The Filipino revolutionaries, the very people who had fought and bled for their country's freedom, stood at the gates of their own capital and were forbidden from entering. The betrayal was complete, but the final, most devastating blow was still to come. With the war over, Spain and the United States met in Paris to negotiate a peace treaty. The Filipino people, who had already declared their own independent republic, sent a representative, Felipe Agoncillo, to plead their case. He was locked out of the negotiations, his nation's sovereignty completely ignored. Inside, the fate of the Philippines was being decided. America's initial war goal was to free Cuba, but the victory at Manila Bay opened up a tempting new possibility. President William McKinley and other American expansionists saw the Philippines as a strategic gateway to Asian markets and a key piece in their dream of building a global empire. Spain, defeated and broke, was in no position to argue. To make the transfer official and save Spain some face, the United States offered a payment. In Article 3 of the Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, Spain agreed to cede the Philippine Islands to the United States. In return, the U.S. would pay Spain $20 million. Nominally, this was for public buildings and infrastructure Spain had built, but everyone knew what it really was, the price tag for a country. For that sum, the United States acquired over 7,000 islands and a nation of millions. The deal was done. Back in the Philippines, the reaction was shock and outrage. The alliance had been a lie, the promise of freedom, a sham. Their country had been treated like property. What followed wasn't peace, but a new and even bloodier war. On February 4, 1899, just 2 days before the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty, fighting erupted between American and Filipino soldiers in Manila. This single shot ignited the Philippine-American War, a brutal and often forgotten conflict that would last for years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The United States called it the Philippine Insurrection, painting the Filipinos as rebels, not as patriots fighting for their homeland. President McKinley's administration claimed a policy of benevolent assimilation, arguing that U.S. rule was for the Filipinos' own good. The reality on the ground, however, was anything but benevolent. The war was savage. U.S. forces, frustrated by a determined guerrilla resistance, resorted to horrific tactics. They burned villages, established concentration camps, and used torture on suspected fighters. Filipino forces also committed atrocities against captured soldiers and collaborators. The human cost was staggering. Over 4,200 American soldiers and an estimated 20,000 Filipino soldiers died in combat. But the greatest tragedy was the loss of civilian life. While historians debate the exact numbers, it's estimated that anywhere from 200,000 to over 1 million Filipino civilians died from violence, famine, and disease. It was a horrific price to pay for a freedom that had been promised and then snatched away. Emilio Aguinaldo was captured in 1901, and organized Filipino resistance began to fade, though fighting continued for more than a decade. The United States would govern the Philippines as a colony until finally granting its independence on July 4, 1946, after the end of World War II. For years, July 4th was celebrated as Independence Day, but in 1964, the Philippines officially changed the date to June 12th. This was a powerful act to reclaim their own history, honoring the day in 1898 when Filipinos first declared their freedom for themselves. The sale of the Philippines for $20 million stands as a painful chapter in world history. It was a cynical transaction that ignored the will of a people and laid bare the cold realities of imperial ambition. For Spain, it was the final nail in the coffin of a dying empire. For the United States, it was a controversial debut as a colonial power, tarnishing its self-proclaimed image as a beacon of liberty. And for the Philippines, it was the ultimate betrayal. A revolution won and an independence declared, all sold for a pocketful of silver. The story is a stark reminder that the course of history is too often decided not by ideals of freedom, but by the cold, hard math of power and money.